Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the Middle East and, specifically what's been happening there in 2025. You sent over like a ton of articles and reports, and wow, this stuff is wild. We're talking like major regime changes, peace deals that seem like they could fall apart any minute, and this whole new power dynamic that's developing.
It really is a period of intense transformation. I
Hmm.
mean, the events of the past year have just completely shaken things up, and the ripple effects are being felt across the entire region.
Yeah, so to try to make sense of all of this, I think maybe we should start with Syria. After decades under the Assad family, they have a new government. But here's where it gets really interesting, right? The new government is led by a former leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which a lot of countries consider a terrorist organization. So, like, what do we even make of that?
It's a very, very complicated situation. On the one hand, HTS seems to be trying to distance itself from what they did in the past. Like, they issued amnesties to people who used to be in the Syrian army, and they even got rid of some of the old regime institutions, like the parliament. It seems like they're actually trying to make some real changes.
It's like they're trying to hit the reset button on the entire country. But the question is, does that even work when so much of the world still sees them as the bad guys?
That is exactly the challenge they're facing. They're walking this tightrope. They're trying to convince the international community that they've changed while also trying to rebuild the country after a decade of war. And on top of all that, they still have to deal with all the different armed groups that are still operating in Syria. It's a lot to handle.
And speaking of armed groups, what about the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF? They control a big part of northeast Syria. The sources mention they haven't disbanded, but there are some rumors they might be open to it, if the conditions are right.
The SDF is really important in all of this. Their relationship with this new Syrian government is going to be a huge factor in whether or not there can be a lasting peace in Syria. I mean, if they can find some way to work together, it could be a path to a more stable future. But if tensions between them increase, well, it could easily spark even more conflict.
So it's this delicate dance, right, with everyone trying to figure out what their next move is going to be. And speaking of delicate dances, let's move over to Lebanon. There's a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, but the sources make it sound pretty tense. Like they're saying that there are violations almost every day and that things are really volatile.
Yeah, the ceasefire agreement was supposed to lead to Israel withdrawing and Hezbollah disarming, but that hasn't exactly happened the way it was supposed to. Israel is still in some strategic positions, and Hezbollah has been organizing these protests, some of which have actually turned violent, some have even been deadly.
And then in the middle of all this, you have the Lebanese people who are stuck. I mean, their economy is a mess. Their infrastructure has been destroyed. Their government is basically paralyzed. It's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It's a really bad situation.
Mm.
The Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, are supposed to be stepping up to secure the country, but I mean, they just don't have the resources they need.
Yeah.
It's a monumental task they're facing,
Hmm.
and they're not equipped to handle it. The big question is, can they actually assert control and prevent another conflict?
And with all of this turmoil in Syria and Lebanon, it's having this ripple effect across the whole region. One article even described it as like a geopolitical chessboard flipped over. So what exactly does that mean for the balance of power in the Middle East?
Right. It's causing a huge power shift. For a long time, Iran was the dominant force. They've been backing groups like Hezbollah, and they've been exerting their influence all over the region. But they've had some serious setbacks lately, which has created space for other countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey to kind of step in and fill that vacuum.
And this is where things start to get really interesting. The sources suggest that Saudi Arabia is making some pretty bold moves. They're increasing their involvement in both Lebanon and Syria. They're using their money to try to influence things. And they're even exploring the possibility of normalizing relations with Israel, which is a big change from their usual position.
Yeah, it is. And what's so fascinating is that Saudi Arabia seems to be trying to fill the space that's been left by the U.S. With the U.S. being less engaged in the region, they're taking on a more assertive role and trying to reshape the regional order in a way that benefits them. And the possibility of normalization with Israel, I mean, that could really change the entire geopolitical landscape.
So you have Saudi Arabia asserting itself, and then you have Turkey, which is expanding its influence in northern Syria. And they're trying to create this buffer zone to keep the Kurdish forces in check. It seems like everyone is jockeying for position, trying to protect their own interests in all this uncertainty.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of multipolarity comes in. We're moving away from a world where one superpower, like the U.S., makes all the decisions. We're moving towards a system where multiple centers of power are competing for influence.
So it's not just about who has the biggest military anymore. It's about the economy, it's about diplomacy, it's about alliances, and it sounds like the rules of the game are still being figured out.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. This shift to multipolarity is shaking up the old world order and creating new opportunities and new risks. And the big question is, how will these regional powers navigate this new world? And what will it all mean for the future of the Middle East? So picking up where we left off, let's talk more about Syria and this new chapter for them. It's a country that's trying to rebuild after such a devastating war, and now they have this government that's led by former members of HTS, a group that not long ago a lot of people considered terrorists.
Yeah, it's pretty ironic when you think about it. They've gone from being sanctioned and isolated to now, like, trying to govern and rebuild an entire country. So what does that shift mean for their relationships with other countries? You mentioned the SDF earlier. What's the latest with them?
The SDF situation is really interesting. They control a pretty large area of northeastern Syria, which has a lot of oil resources. They were a key ally for the U.S. in the fight against ISIS, but now they have to figure out how they can coexist with this new government.
So what's it like between them? Are they working together or are they heading for a clash?
Well, the sources kind of suggest it's a bit of both. There have been some talks, even some limited cooperation on security, especially in the border areas where their territory overlaps. But there's a lot of mistrust on both sides.
I can imagine. I mean, the SDS spent years fighting against the Assad regime and HTS, and they've built their own autonomous region with the help of the U.S. I bet they're not too keen on giving that up.
Exactly. And the new Syrian government sees that SDF-controlled territory as theirs, rightfully theirs. Plus, they're wary of the U.S. influence there. So yeah, it's really fragile. Any wrong move could lead to more fighting.
Let's talk about the U.S. for a minute. They've been a major player in Syria, first fighting ISIS and then supporting the SDF. So what's their position now with this new government in charge?
The U.S. is in a really tricky spot. They called HTS a terrorist organization, but now that group is essentially running the show. So what did they do? Did they try to engage with them, or did they keep isolating them? And what about the SDF? Do they still support them? It's a tough situation with no easy solutions.
And how about Russia? What are they doing? They were Assad's main supporter, and they still have a lot of military personnel in Syria.
Well, Russia's goals haven't really changed. They want to keep their influence in Syria, and they want to hold on to their military bases on the Mediterranean. The question is, how do they do that with everything that's changed? It looks like they're trying to position themselves as a go-between, urging both the new government and the SDF to find a peaceful solution.
So Russia's playing the long game, trying to keep their leverage while everything shifts around them. What about Iran? They were very involved in Syria under Assad.
Yeah, there's no question Iran's influence has definitely been weakened. With Assad gone and their own resources stretched thin, their ability to control things in Syria isn't what it used to be. But they still have allies and proxies in the country, and they're not going to just abandon Syria. They're definitely paying attention to how everything plays out.
We talked earlier about how Saudi Arabia is being more assertive in the region. What are they actually doing in Syria?
Saudi Arabia is trying to use its money to gain influence. They've promised a lot of financial aid to help with rebuilding, but they're also making it clear that they want the new government to move away from Iran and work with them, align with their vision for the region.
So it sounds like Syria has become like this center of a regional power struggle. Everyone wants to control its future. But what about the Syrian people? I mean, they've suffered so much already.
That's the sad part of it all. The Syrian people are exhausted after years of war. All they want is peace and stability. But they're caught in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war. Millions of them are still displaced, and the country is in ruins. Rebuilding is going to be a massive job, and it's going to take a lot of help from outside.
It's a really good reminder that behind all the geopolitics, there are real people whose lives have been completely turned upside down. Now, before we move on from Syria, let's talk a bit more about this idea of multipolarity that you brought up. You said that the world is moving away from this U.S.-dominated system to a more fragmented one with multiple power centers.
That's right. And you can really see that shift in how other countries are approaching Syria. They're not waiting for the U.S. to tell them what to do. They're going after their own interests and forming alliances based on their own calculations.
Can you give us an example of how that's happening?
Well, look at what's happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Despite being rivals and being on opposite sides in Syria, they've actually been working to improve relations and cooperate on some issues, things like oil production and regional security. That's a really big deal and something that would have been hard to imagine just a few years ago.
So they're realizing they have some things in common, and they're willing to set aside their differences to get what they want. It seems like the old rules just don't apply anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this has implications that go far beyond just Syria. You can see similar things happening in other parts of the world where regional powers are saying we're doing our own thing and challenging the traditional power of the West.
This brings up a pretty interesting question for our listeners. If the U.S. isn't the only superpower calling the shots anymore, does that make the world more dangerous? Or could this actually lead to a more balanced and multipolar world where power is shared more equally?
It's a really complicated question.
Yeah.
But one thing is clear, we're in new territory, and it's going to be interesting. It could also be pretty turbulent.
We've talked a lot about Syria. Now let's get back to Lebanon. We talked before about the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, but let's look at that a little closer.
The situation in Lebanon is really tense. It feels like things could explode at any moment. The ceasefire agreement stopped the major fighting, but there have been a lot of violations.
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty grim picture of what daily life is like in Lebanon. Their economy is a mess, and just basic services are barely functioning. How are people coping with all of that?
It's really, really bad. The Lebanese pound has lost almost all its value. Prices are going through the roof, and there are no jobs. The cost of food and gas and other basic stuff has become too much for a lot of people. They're just struggling to survive.
And they also have to live with this constant worry that the fighting could start again.
Right. And the sources say that the Lebanese Armed Forces, the LAF, they're supposed to be in charge of security, but it's an almost impossible task. They don't have enough people, they don't have enough money, and they don't have the equipment they need to actually control things.
Plus, historically, they've been influenced by different political groups within Lebanon, which can't be helping.
Yeah, that definitely makes things harder. There's this lack of trust in their ability to be fair and keep order. And then you have Hezbollah, which is really powerful and well-armed, still operating within the country. It's a very volatile situation.
It sounds like Lebanon is trapped. A terrible economy, a weak political system, and the constant threat of more conflict.
It's like all these problems coming together at once, and it's putting huge pressure on the people and the government. It shows you just how fragile peace can be and how easily things can fall apart.
The sources mention that the ceasefire was supposed to include Israel withdrawing from southern Lebanon and Hezbollah disarming. What's happening with that?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated.
Yeah.
Israel hasn't withdrawn on schedule,
Hmm.
saying they're worried about the LAF's ability to control the border and stop Hezbollah from regrouping.
And what about Hezbollah? How have they reacted to that?
They've said no to any extensions of the deadlines, and they've organized protests along the border. Some of those protests have turned violent. Hezbollah's leaders have made it very clear they won't accept any more delays in the Israeli withdrawal.
So it's a standoff. Neither side is backing down, and the people in Lebanon are caught in the middle.
It's heartbreaking. They're the ones paying the price for a conflict they didn't start. They're trapped between what Israel wants, what Hezbollah does, and the limits of their own government.
It doesn't sound very hopeful. It doesn't seem like there are any easy solutions.
It definitely shows how much conflict hurts people and how important it is to find a lasting peace.
Well, Syria and Lebanon are both at critical points. They're facing huge challenges and a lot of uncertainty, and all of this is happening as the whole world is changing. So let's step back now and look at the bigger picture, the global power shift that we've been talking about.
Okay, let's broaden our view and think about how what's happening in the Middle East is affecting the whole world.
We've been discussing the decline of U.S. influence and how regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Turkey are becoming more powerful. But what does that actually mean for global power? How does it change the way countries interact with each other?
We're seeing a shift away from a world where the U.S. makes all the decisions. That unipolar world is fading. What's emerging is a more multipolar system. It's not just about military strength anymore. It's about money. It's about diplomacy. And it's about being able to influence things in a more subtle way in a world where everything is connected.
So basically, it's a much more complex game than it used to be.
Exactly. And it needs different skills and different strategies. The old ways of doing things, using military force or economic sanctions, they're not working as well anymore. Countries have to change and find new ways to get what they want in this new world.
Can you give us some specific examples of how this multipolarity thing is working in the real world?
Sure. Look at the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They're challenging the G7 more and more, creating their own institutions and ways of governing the world. They want a multipolar world where power is shared more fairly.
So it's not just something happening in one region, it's happening everywhere.
Exactly. And it's affecting everything: trade, finance, security, diplomacy, the whole thing. And another big part of this change is the rise of China as a global economic power.
So what does all this mean for everyday people? How does this power shift affect our lives?
Well, first of all, it means we live in a world that's much less predictable. The old rules are gone, and it's harder to know what's going to happen next. There's more competition between countries, and that could lead to more instability and conflict. But it also creates possibilities for new partnerships and working together.
It feels like we're at this point where things could go either way. Things could get a lot better or a lot worse.
That's a good way to put it. It's a time of transition, and the decisions we make now will have a big impact in the future.
It's all a bit overwhelming. What can we as individuals do to make sense of this world that's getting more and more complicated?
The most important thing is to stay informed and be involved. We need to learn about what's shaping our world and participate in the global conversation. And we need to be critical thinkers, question the information you see, and try to get different perspectives.
So don't just believe the headlines. Dig deeper, question what you're told, and be open to having your own views challenged.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and watch. We need to be actively involved in shaping the future.
So we've spent this deep dive looking at all the huge changes that are happening in the Middle East, right? Like the unexpected new government in Syria, the peace that feels so shaky in Lebanon, and how the balance of power is shifting in the whole region. And we've even talked about how this is all part of this global power shift. So where do we go from here? What are the big things we should be thinking about?
I think one of the most important things to remember is that the old Middle East, the way things used to be, is really gone. The time when the U.S. controlled everything, that's fading away. And we're seeing this new multipolar system emerge, with lots of different power centers. And that means more uncertainty, for sure, more competition, but it also means more opportunity for the regional powers to do their own thing.
We saw that with Saudi Arabia and how assertive they've been, right?
Yeah.
Exploring, normalizing things with Israel and even that rapprochement with Iran. It's pretty wild considering they've been rivals for so long. It seems like they're not waiting for Washington to tell them what to do anymore.
Exactly. They're making their own moves. And that's a really big deal for U.S. foreign policy. For decades, they were used to being the ones who decided what happened in the region. But now they had to get used to a world where they don't have as much control and other countries are making the decisions.
So does that mean the U.S. is just going to completely pull out of the Middle East?
Not necessarily, but they do need to change how they approach things. The old ways, sending in the military or using sanctions, that's not working as well as it used to. They need to focus more on diplomacy, building alliances, and actually working with partners in the region.
And how do you see that playing out in places like Syria and Lebanon, where the U.S. has been so heavily involved?
Well, in Syria, the U.S. has a really tough problem. They said HTS was a terrorist organization, but now they're the ones in charge. If the U.S. tries to work with them, it might look like they're saying it's okay that this group they condemned is now in power. But if they ignore them, things could get even worse in Syria.
It's a hard situation to be in. And then there's Lebanon. They're dealing with a terrible economy, political instability, and the possibility that Israel and Hezbollah could start fighting again at any moment. Is there anything the U.S. can do to help stabilize things there?
The U.S. has tried to be a mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but their influence isn't what it used to be. And with the power shifting in the region, it's not even clear if they can still bring those sides together.
So basically, there are no easy answers.
Yeah. And that's what makes this time so interesting and important. We're watching the Middle East change in a really fundamental way, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. The decisions that get made now, they'll have a huge impact on the region and the whole world.
Okay, so for everyone listening, here's something to think about. If the Middle East doesn't need the U.S. as much anymore, does that make the world safer? Or could it actually lead to more chaos and conflict?
It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but it's one we all need to be thinking about, because what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. What happens there affects everyone.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Middle East. We've talked about a lot, and it's obvious that the region is at a turning point. The old ways are gone, and something new is being created. What that new thing will be, well, we're still figuring that out. But it's important for all of us to stay informed, stay involved, and be ready to deal with the challenges of a world that's constantly changing.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.